This is Intelligence Matters.
I'm Michael Allen with Beacon Global Strategies. Today I'm joined by Mr. Eddie Fishman, a foreign policy expert, currently serving as senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy and an adjunct professor of international and public affairs at Columbia University. Mr. Fishman previously served at the State Department as a member of the Secretary's planning staff for John Kerry, advising on Europe and leading the staff's work on sanctions. Mr. Fishman joins us today for a discussion on his new book, Chokepoints, American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare, where he sheds light on how the United States has engaged in economic warfare with Russia, Iran, China, and the geopolitical implications of those activities. Stay with us as we speak with Eddie Fishman. Welcome, Eddie.
Michael, thanks so much for having me on the podcast today.
Well, Eddie, thanks so much. And did you ever think that a book about economic sanctions would be on the New York Times bestseller list?
I got to be honest, Michael, when I was actually giving a talk at Stanford and I turned my phone off a couple Wednesdays ago, and when I turned it back on and my agent had emailed me like 5 times telling me that this was on the bestseller list, and I thought she was making a joke. But no, look, I think it does reflect the fact that we are living in an age of economic warfare and everyone has to pay attention to sanctions and tariffs and export controls today.
So what your book does is talk about the hotspots around the globe, economic warfare with Russia, Iran, and China. So we're going to try to go through each of these over the course of the conversation. But first, can you just sort of give our listeners and our folks listening in here a sense for the development of these tools? As I understand it, immediately after post 9/11, we started figuring out ways to go after funders of terrorism in a big way. And then I think these tools later grew from that effort. Do I have that right?
That's exactly right, Michael. And I think maybe the best way to explain what's new about economic warfare today, because look, sanctions and tariffs and embargoes, they've existed forever, right? Going back to ancient Greece, is to look at what sanctions look like right before that pivot point of 9/11. So in the 1990s, many will remember the UN embargo on Saddam Hussein's Iraq, which goes into effect right after Saddam invades Kuwait in 1990, stays in place for 13 years. That embargo, which really focused on trying to stop Iraq from selling oil, was implemented by a multinational naval force. Over 20 nations had deployed ships to the Persian Gulf that were patrolling the waters for 24/7 for 13 straight years, inspecting vessels coming in and out of Iraqi ports to ensure that there wasn't any oil coming onto global markets. And so what economic warfare looked like, even as recently as the 90s, it was really run out of the Pentagon. You needed things like naval force to make it impactful. What happens is really 2 factors. One is hyperglobalization in the 90s, where you bring in China and Russia into the global financial system, into supply chains. And then that pivot point of 9/11, where the United States develops the legal authorities to impose sanctions on individuals, on companies around the world. And what we are able to do then is weaponize choke points like the dollar, like supply chains against Russia and Iran, not by deploying ships, but really just by signing documents in the Treasury Department or in the Commerce Department.
All right. Well, I want to get to how effective that's been when we talk about Iran and maximum pressure and the rest. But just one more overarching type of question. I suppose this has been greatly to the benefit of the United States as a superpower to be able to weaponize these economic tools. Is that right?
Yes.
But now we're worried about overusing them, and we'll get to that.
Agreed. Yes.
Okay, good. All right, well, let's go to Russia, where Ukraine is in the news. President Trump is trying to broker a ceasefire between the two parties. There's been a huge sanctions regime. Well, maybe I shouldn't say huge. I'll let you try to categorize it. But I remember talking to you about these sanctions after the first invasion of Ukraine way back when. And now, today, how effective have these sanctions been in crippling the Russian economy?
So Russia's economy right now is clearly not doing very well. For 2025, the Central Bank of Russia projects zero growth effectively. So for those of us who've spent too many years of our lives trying to parse Kremlin statements. Zero growth probably translates into something like a significant recession in Russia. You also have extremely high inflation. The official inflation rate is close to 10%. So again, probably quite a bit higher on the ground. And you can't get anything like a home mortgage in Russia for anything less than 30%. So where the Russian economy is right now, Michael, is there's basically no productive investment outside of the government pouring money into the military industrial complex. All the investment is either going into making weapons that are then deployed and destroyed in the battlefield in Ukraine, or recruiting troops that are then sent to fight and oftentimes get injured or die in Ukraine. So Russia's economy is in a very bad place. Some people at the same time have been disappointed with the sanctions because this has been now a sanctions campaign that started back when I was working on this in 2014. It's been 11 years. And even since the initial or the large scale invasion of Ukraine started in 2022, it's been 3 years. So it has taken a while to get to this point. But I think part of the reason you're seeing Putin right now so desperate to cut some sort of bilateral deal with Trump is because his economy is really starting to come apart at the seams.
Okay, and so you would caution someone like me, though, against saying that the economic warfare alone is enough to have a great power capitulate. It's about a massive pressure, but you would say something like, we need all tools of national power. Don't look at this as a silver bullet.
100%. This is one factor. And I think even like narrowly, let's move away even from the prospect of negotiations for a second. Let's just say that we're trying to help the Ukrainians win on the battlefield, right? If this is ultimately, to a certain extent, a war of attrition, aiding the Ukrainians, arming the Ukrainians, providing them a firm financial footing is helpful on the Ukrainian side in prolonging the amount of time that they can fight. The sanctions are sort of the reverse of that. It's sort of weakening Russia's military-industrial complex and shortening the timeline that Putin has to wage this war.
So let's just keep the scorecard here. We were, I think, fond of saying that the Biden administration did levy quite a few sanctions upon the Russian economy, and that obviously had some effect because you just outlined it. But at the end of the day, they didn't really enforce aggressively the price cap. Am I right on oil? And then it hasn't just the sale of oil to the Chinese been a life preserver for that economy?
So the biggest weakness in the Biden administration's sanctions campaign against Russia was the hesitancy of the Biden administration to really go full throttle against Russia's energy exports. This is actually something that I got wrong. Early in the war, basically in the first 48 hours of the war, not only the U.S., but also the G7 surprised almost everyone to the upside, going and sanctioning the Central Bank of Russia, which sort of came out of left field and was not even on the escalation ladder. But what happened was the West really maximized sanctions against Russia's financial sector and its military industrial complex, but was really gun shy on the oil and gas sector. And that was because inflation in 2022 was at a 4-decade high. You had oil prices that were above $100 a barrel in the first month or so of the war. And I think Biden was nervous about the domestic political ramifications of going hard on Russian oil. I think in retrospect, it was a mistake. And I think that it would have served Biden to be honest with the American people, to say that this will cause some sort of temporary spike in prices. It may worsen inflation, but it's worth it to try to get a peace settlement sooner, to help the Ukrainians win sooner. And I think, frankly, Michael, from a political standpoint, had he done that in 2022, you would have given the market time to adjust by 2024.
Yeah, I think that's going to be part of the story of the Biden-Ukraine policy in the end. So I think we all overestimated the ability to, quote unquote, cause a massive change in the Russian policy, but we didn't do all that we could have done on the energy sector. But just touch briefly on the Chinese. First of all, oil and gas generally, they're still exporting it to whom besides the Chinese, and hasn't that been what's kept them afloat?
Sure. So I'll start with gas because it's a little different. So gas, because primarily Russian gas in particular, is shipped by pipeline. You can't just build an oil pipeline overnight. And the vast majority of Russian gas exports had been going to Europe via pipeline. In the summer of 2022, Russia actually cut off a lot of those exports as an economic weapon against Europe. So this was actually a choke point that the Russians possessed that they thought they were going to use to bully the Europeans to back off, right? Then, of course, you wind up having the act of sabotage that winds up damaging the Nord Stream pipelines. And where we are now is the Russian-European energy relationship is in shambles, right? And so Russia has not actually been able to replace the European gas market. And that's because they can't build pipelines overnight. The only way to export the gas would be through liquefied natural gas. But the U.S. has very aggressively sanctioned Russian liquefied natural gas projects. And that's because, A, it stops Russia from exporting this gas, and B, it's really the American LNG producers in the Gulf Coast who are taking market share away from the Russians in places like Europe. On oil, which is actually more important for the Russian economy, what you said, Michael, is 100% accurate. So Russia had been selling something like half of its oil exports to Europe. Europe imposed a full-scale embargo, effectively. There's some very small exceptions in December of 2022. But Russia successfully rerouted virtually all of its oil sales to China to a certain extent, but actually largely to India. So India went from buying virtually no Russian oil to something like 2 million barrels of oil a day, which is a giant amount of oil. I think it's the largest source of imported oil for India now. So they have successfully rerouted their oil exports. The Biden administration actually encouraged this, and because they didn't want Russian oil to come off the market. But I think, in some ways that turned out to be quite a bit of a mistake, because in some ways, you've ossified the India-Russia relationship on the energy sector.
So while we're at it, just before we close out on Russia, could you just comment a little bit on how the Chinese have kept them afloat in other areas besides oil? And two, how were they so successful in converting their economy to a wartime economy?
Yeah. Good questions. So look, Russia still has quite a bit of industrial capacity, just even going back to the Soviet days, right? Heavy industry has been something that the Russian economy has, specialized in, right? So in some ways, it wasn't a very difficult transition. I think also the state has been playing a larger role in Russia's economy throughout, Putin's 2+ decades in the Kremlin. So in some ways, it's almost a natural conclusion of it. On the China side, though, if you think about what's happening, so China is buying quite a bit of energy from Russia. And then what they're doing basically in exchange is they're selling widgets to Russia for the military industrial complex. That goes from everything from chips, some that are smuggled, others that are lawfully obtained and then resold to Russia, to machine tools, that the Russians use to produce weapons. So, look, I think China has been a lifeline to Russia economically, in that they are buying the large share of Russian oil. They've also, critically, Russia has now become the first major economy to really effectively yuanize its economy. It's doing most of its foreign trade in RMB, the Chinese currency. It's accumulating its foreign exchange reserves now in RMB. But on the other side, they're also getting important components from China. So this relationship is economically and strategically essential for Putin right now.
Okay, so let's bridge between China and Iran and maximum pressure. Let me just ask you, what is a secondary sanction?
Secondary sanctions are different from primary sanctions. Primary sanctions would be when the U.S. imposes sanctions on, let's say, Bank Melli, the largest bank in Iran. What that would mean, Michael, is that U.S. companies, U.S. banks, U.S. persons can't do any business with Bank Melli, right? It's like any other regulation put on Americans.
But we weren't doing much with Bank Melli anyway, so it's not a big sanction.
Not a huge sanction. A secondary sanction would be to say, any foreign bank that transacts with Bank Melli is then potentially sanctioned by the United States. So let's say the Bank of China then does a transaction with Bank Melli. We then would potentially sanction the Bank of China. And the thing about secondary sanctions is there's nothing automatic about them, right? Like if I were tomorrow to try to do a transaction with Bank Melli, I'd be breaking American law. I'd almost certainly be fined. I may face prison time, right? We don't have that kind of regulatory authority over a Chinese bank. What we can do, though, is go to that Chinese bank and say, if you keep doing this, we will sanction you. You will be cut off from the U.S. financial system. So it's basically like giving a foreign company a choice, which is, do you want to do business with the United States, or do you want to do business with either Iran or Russia or whoever the target is of the sanctions?
And so that's been the power of the Iranian maximum pressure campaign since its inception, right?
Yes. Secondary sanctions were really pioneered against Iran and have been tremendously successful against Iran.
Okay, so President Trump just resumed maximum pressure. And we say this term all the time, but why don't you unpack it for us? It's not just sanctions, is it?
No. So look, sometimes, there are buzzwords, right? And it is important to, scratch beneath the surface and see what is actually meant by this. So the first maximum pressure campaign Trump put in place in May of 2018, after he pulls out of the Iran nuclear deal. And what that looked like at the time, Michael, was basically the reimposition of all of the sanctions that had been waived as a result of the JCPOA. So these were all of the nuclear-related secondary sanctions. So for instance, secondary financial sanctions. If you're transacting with Bank Melli or the Central Bank of Iran, you then could be sanctioned by the United States. There wasn't much in terms of going above and beyond what the Obama-era sanctions were, because really the Obama-era sanctions were effectively maximally impactful, right? So it was basically reimposing them. And then a second order thing that's important, and that's hard to assess just by reading documents or statements, is they actually committed to enforcing very vigorously. And so that's more of a manpower issue, designating people at the Office of Foreign Assets Control, at the Justice Department to work on the Iran file and to really enforce these sanctions and to focus on that enforcement.
So sanctions came off when President Obama did his nuclear deal known as the JCPOA. And so Trump comes in and says, I need to reimpose all of these.
Exactly.
After he got out of the deal. Okay, good. All right. So I wrote an article recently about two clocks. One is Israel has a unique opportunity to go after the Iranian nuclear program because of Hezbollah has been degraded. It's easier to get to Iran now because they've been able to shoot up all the surface-to-air missile sites and radars, etc. And this window won't last forever. So Israel's got their clock. And also, the United States has its own clock because we want to be able to give maximum pressure time to work to hopefully force the Iranians back to the negotiating table. And people doubt that President Trump is up for bombing the program. And the Israelis may not be able to do it on their own. So what do you think about the reimposition of maximum pressure? Doesn't this take a long time? And can't the Iranians, just like last time, they can take a punch. They seem willing to face economic misery for a long period of time before capitulating.
I agree. I actually don't think sanctions are going to be the difference maker right now with respect to Iran. And maybe it's worth also just looking how things have changed on the economic front with Iran, even since 2018. Right now, Iran sells effectively 100% of its oil. This is 1 million or 1.5 million barrels a day to China. So whereas with Russia, you have China, you have India, you have the UAE, you have Turkey, you've got sort of a bunch of important economic partners. With Iran, there's really one economic partner that matters. And so if you're actually, let's say if Trump wanted to cut Iran's oil exports to zero, which is something that Republicans have wanted to do for a while, and actually a number of the more hawkish Democrats have wanted to do for a while. What you'd really need to do is you need to cut a deal with Xi Jinping. You're not going to use secondary sanctions to persuade every single refinery in China to stop buying Iranian oil. You're going to have to go to Xi Jinping and say, this is the number one priority in the U.S.-China relationship. And if you don't do this, there's going to be serious consequences in our bilateral relationship. And I would be surprised if that is the number one priority.
Me too. I don't think it is.
So I'm skeptical, even though Trump signed a document instructing agencies to go ahead with maximum pressure. We actually haven't seen that yet. We have not seen aggressive new sanctions on Iran. And that's because really what aggressive new sanctions on Iran would be aggressive sanctions on China.
Yeah.
And we haven't seen that, and I don't think we will.
So unlike last time when we were able to actually go to even some of our allies like South Korea and say, please quit importing Iranian oil, now the vast majority of it is going to, let's call it an axis of upheaval state. China and Iran have newer, grander relationship now. So we're going to have a really hard time, aren't we, in general, incentivizing the Chinese to cooperate.
Agree. And I also just think from a narrower U.S. perspective, the Iranians are prostrate right now for all the reasons you mentioned, right? Their economy is not doing well, but more to the point, their deterrent has been decimated, right? I mean, Hezbollah decimated, their air defenses, significantly weakened, right? I mean, there's a reason why you mentioned, I agree with you, there's this window for an Israeli strike, right? So I think the biggest incentive for the Iranian regime right now to cut a deal is to ward off that kind of an outcome. And I actually commend President Trump for seeking diplomacy, because I think he has the Iranians in a position where he could get a deal. And if you think about it from the American political context, if Trump delivers a JCPOA 2.0, I think that's the type of thing that actually could survive the American domestic political meat grinder.
I do too, because you would have so many Republicans in the Congress support it if Trump did it, whereas they didn't when Obama did it. So maximum pressure is going to be really hard to reimpose for the reasons that we've just stated. And so this does get back to me, the clock that Israel's on. Israel just might be thinking, I can't wait forever. In fact, maximum pressure isn't going to work like it did last time. And even if it did, it doesn't seem always that the Iranians want to capitulate. They feel like they want to take economic misery rather than, a revolutionary regime cutting a deal with the West again.
Yeah, I agree, Michael. And I think that in the sort of U.S.-Iran situation, it's not just China as this third party who matters because they're an economic lifeline to Iran. It is Israel, as you said, because they see Iran as an existential threat. I don't think Trump wants an Israeli strike on Iran. But then there's actually another player that's relevant that we saw come out of the Trump-Putin call that just happened, which is Russia, because Putin sees the Iran nuclear issue as a wedge for him to say, Trump, I'm going to help you. I'm going to help deliver this deal with the Iranians, and maybe that will be enough for us to normalize our relations. And you saw it come out of the White House joint statement where, Putin and Trump were saying that they discussed cooperation in the Middle East, and that they both committed to the fact that Israel should never be vulnerable to an Iranian strike.
Well, that's crafty, too. It's like, hey, Trump, I may not be able to give you everything that you want on Ukraine, but I'll help you with your other big problem in the Middle East.
Yep. And we've seen it before. I mean, I lived through this, and so did you, Michael. I mean, in 2015, 2016, Sergei Lavrov played this whole game with John Kerry when he was Secretary of State, saying we'd cooperate with you on Syria and we're going to end the war in Syria if you ease off Ukraine. Thankfully, Kerry and the Obama administration didn't go for that, but that was definitely their strategy back then, too.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more of our discussion with Eddie Fishman.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
All right, as we transition to China and the geopolitical competition, I don't want to totally, bore the audience, but I know that Trump is obsessed with, and rightfully so, the U.S. dollar being remaining the reserve currency. And he's very sensitive to the BRICS and others. And I've even heard the Treasury Secretary of late say, and I'm kind of surprised at this, that we need to be more judicious in the implementation and levying of sanctions because we don't want this huge arrow in our quiver to go away. Do I have that right?
You do, exactly.
So where's this coming from so early from the Treasury Secretary, and what do you think that means for the reimposition of sanctions across the board?
Well, look, I think it's now several presidents in a row who've had this concern. It really dates back to 2016. Jack Lew gave this famous speech. He was the Treasury Secretary in the Obama administration, warning that the overuse of sanctions threatened the dollar's role as the reserve currency. When Biden comes in...
I'll just stop you there, but what does that mean?
Sure, yeah.
So for us political science majors, what does it mean to be the reserve currency of the world?
Yeah, so From a narrow perspective, it means that most governments hold their hard currency reserves, their central bank reserves, in dollars. And for a long time now, something like 60% of all reserves around the world are held in dollars.
And that's because as a result of international trade, they receive dollars in their country and put it in their central bank?
Yeah, so exactly. And what they find is that when they want to hold money, when they want to have a secure store of value, it's usually U.S. Treasuries that is where they hold their money. But even if not, American equities, right? So U.S. markets,
they go buy bonds.
Exactly. That's our our deficit, right? Yeah. So look, I and the second place, by the way, is the euro, which is 20%. So we're three times the second place. But I think from the perspective of American power, it's not just the reserve currency role that matters. It's actually even more importantly, the payments role. So if you have two countries, a company in India, for instance, and a company in Saudi Arabia trading with each other, they're not actually trading in their local currencies. They're trading in dollars. And that's because banks around the world, what they'll usually do is they'll hold significant stores of their local currency and then the dollar. And so the sort of lingua franca of the international financial system and the international trading system is the dollar.
It's just easier to do it.
Of course. Because think about it. If you're a bank, what are you going to hold? Enough stocks of 20 different currencies to, clear any potential transaction that comes. And this is why I think, in the foreign exchange market, which is by far the biggest financial market, something like $7 trillion in turnover each day, which is just astronomical. 90% of transactions are in dollars. And we only account for something like 10% of global trade. So you can tell that a lot of transactions are happening that have nothing to do with American exporting something that are using dollars.
So I get why that's good for the imposition of sanctions, because you just explained very well secondary sanctions to us. But what's the benefit of us being the lingua franca currency for the whole world?
Well,
other than the imposition of sanctions.
For the world or for the United States?
Well, for the United States to be all over the world.
Yeah, right. So I think for the U.S., the most obvious reason that this is important is it does allow us to run budget deficits, right? I think if we did not have a currency where there's just constant demand, the U.S. couldn't rack up the types of deficits that we do year after year after year after year. And so it's actually the entire American domestic economic and government model relies on the dollar being the world's reserve currency. The interesting thing, though, Michael, is I agree that Trump is obsessed with keeping the dollar as the world's reserve currency. For good reason. But there are elements of his administration, including very powerful people like Stephen Miran, who want to devalue the dollar, right? Who see the dollar's strength as something that has been very bad for manufacturing, for instance, in the United States. Because when the dollar is artificially strengthened by the fact that other countries have demand for dollars that isn't about American exports, but really just about holding dollars and investing in treasuries, it makes the dollar more powerful than it should be. And as a result, it weakens the competitiveness of American exports because it means that for other countries to buy a widget from a U.S. company, it's more expensive than it would otherwise be.
Okay, so this is why we're going to eventually see something called the Mar-a-Lago Accords, which we'll have you back on. All right, so what's new is that over the last 8 to 10 years, it's really become clear for everyone that we're in the age of geopolitical competition, and our primary adversary is, of course, China. And we're in an economic competition with us. But can you talk about, and do you anticipate greater economic warfare, your term, with and against the Chinese?
I do. And I think the important place to start here is 2018, because this is when both the trade war with China starts. This is when Bob Lighthizer, the U.S. trade representative, concludes his 301 investigation and we start doing tariffs. But it's also when ZTE is added to the entity list in April of 2018, and the company almost goes out of business. This is the second biggest telecommunications equipment maker in China. And this is really what was the light bulb moment for the first Trump administration that they could weaponize the semiconductor supply chain against big Chinese companies. Eventually, of course, they do this to Huawei, and then the Biden administration takes that policy and expands it to the entire Chinese economy. So you have sort of these parallel tracks of trade and tech war. At the time, Trump has this comment where he says, trade wars are good and easy to win. And the reason he believes that is because the US imports so much more from China than we sell to China that we can always impose more tariffs than they can, right? Because there's just more that we buy from them than the other way around. What's happened, though, in the last 7 years, because it's been 7 years since 2018, is China has built a fulsome economic arsenal such that they're not just retaliating with tariffs, they're retaliating with the types of sanctions and export controls that we use, right? So they've imposed, in just the last couple of weeks after Trump imposed an incremental 20% tariff on Chinese imports, China has imposed sanctions on Illumina, a DNA sequencer company, on PVH, the apparel manufacturer, on Skydio, the big drone company in Silicon Valley. And these are sanctions that are crippling some of these companies. I mean, Skydio has had to ration batteries because they don't have enough batteries for all of their drones. China's also imposing things like export controls, where they're barring the sales of rare earth minerals like gallium and germanium and antimony to the United States. And then finally, they're also using sort of these almost like distinctive Chinese weapons of economic warfare, where they're weaponizing things like anti-monopoly regulations against American companies like NVIDIA and Google. And so the thing I worry about, Michael, isn't so much that Trump is going to, greatly expand an economic war with China on his own volition, although, of course, he's done quite a bit on the tariff side already. It's that there's now this sort of tit-for-tat escalatory dynamic built in to the U.S.-China relationship, where we may go with tariffs, they will respond not just with tariffs, but with sanctions and export controls. And it's really challenging to know where that leads, right? It's hard to map out in advance. And usually when these things happen, you wind up in a bit of a spiral where maybe both sides are worse off in the end.
And so it's important for policymakers to remember that when we impose sanctions or export controls, it's not in a vacuum, is it? They're going to develop their own tools and come back over time.
Yeah, I mean, the reason my book talks about an age of economic warfare, it's not because it's just the US using these tools. I mean, I think for a long time, we've been kind of the unipolar hegemon in economic warfare, but that's no longer the case. I mean, China, their economy is 3/4 the size of ours. So they're a very large economy. They now have these legal tools. They basically, since 2018, went through the type of transformation that we went through after 9/11, where we started building the legal apparatus, the government bureaucracy we needed to impose sanctions and tariffs and export controls. Europe has also done this. I mean, Europe built this big anti-coercion instrument that they basically intended to use against China. And now they're talking about potentially using it against the United States. And then, Japan has a cabinet minister for economic security, right? Yeah. That's like the equivalent of us now saying there's a new agency where, the U.S. Department for Economic Security, right? So, I mean, other countries are really beefing up their arsenal as well.
So when we talk about the geopolitical competition with China, we have the military plank where we need to reindustrialize our, military. We need to figure out a way to make Taiwan untakeable, or at least so hard to take that the Chinese won't do anything. What do we need to do for the economic plank in the geopolitical competition? And do you think policymakers fully appreciate this?
I don't think policymakers fully appreciate it. And this is probably because even though I spent a big part of my career in Washington, D.C. For much of the last decade, I've been in New York. And I come back and forth quite a bit, as you know, Michael. And I always find the conversations in New York and Washington, even though we're so close, to be very different on China. Where I'm in D.C., I hear about this bipartisan consensus that China is evil and that, they're our adversary and we can't be doing any business with them. And then you go to New York and it's, hold on a second, they're one of our top 3 trading partners. We've got $600 billion in bilateral trade. We still have a lot of exposure to Chinese financial markets. Like, this isn't a relationship that's going to collapse overnight. And in fact, to the extent that the U.S.-China trade relationship has declined, there's a lot of evidence that this is just rerouting of supply chains, right? It's China exporting things to Mexico or other countries that then come into the United States. So I think that the rhetoric and the ideology on China has gotten far out in front of the economic realities on the ground. The thing I think we need to do, Michael, is we need to actually create a realistic plan for phased de-risking and decoupling from China, because it's not going to happen overnight. And I think if we basically continue with this rhetoric but not reality, I worry that in the event that we wake up tomorrow and we hear that, there are Chinese military vessels that are inspecting every cargo coming in and out of Taiwan's ports, and there's something like a naval quarantine or blockade, that our politicians will be very nervous about imposing real sanctions or export controls on China, because there's just so much at stake. And we got over talking, just a few minutes ago about how Biden was nervous about sanctioning Russian energy because of the fears of inflation and oil prices. I mean, imagine doing Russia or Iran style sanctions on China, right? You're not just talking about inflation, you're talking about recession, right? Global recession. So I think in order for us to credibly be able to deter a Chinese invasion, we need resilience at home, right? We need to be prepared for those types of scenarios. And I think what that means is, to a certain extent, decoupling from China. But I think critically, it is tightening our supply chains with allies, right?
Yeah.
With our friends.
Right. So, okay, reshoring, onshoring, other things like that. So you mentioned Taiwan. Let me just run something by you. The China hawks in town say things like, if China were to take Taiwan over, that would be them imposing themselves onto the first island chain. And then so much of our international trade goes through the sea lanes around the South China Sea. China would be in a position to dominate this area and eventually project power outward. Is that, these are non-economic people like me, is that plausible? Do you think that China would unjustifiably use that new position in the South China Sea against U.S. trade and commerce, or that's just not in their interest and that would be crazy?
It's a great question. I mean, and I think it's worth considering that, because I think it's not necessarily the case that all of a sudden they would cut off trade, right? I mean, it would be bad for them too. I think the real question is, are we comfortable in the United States with China having that kind of a kill switch over our trading relationships? And I think we have gotten accustomed over the last many decades to hegemony, right? To dominance, where we don't have to worry about the security of our sea lanes, right? Because the US Navy dominates in all the key areas of the globe. So it's a fair question. And I think, is there a world where there could be some sort of understanding or accord with China? Potentially. But I think at least now there's not confidence, and I think rightfully so, in the CCP having that amount of leverage over the American economic health.
Okay. So it's worth continuing to build up Taiwan deterrence, because we really have to worry what the Chinese might do if they got into that position.
Yes. And I think, I guess critically, and this is an area where I feel like I'm a little bit maybe out of consensus, because I think the two key parts of deterrence are on the military side, which the Pentagon has been doing very effectively, and then it's actually on the domestic resiliency side. I don't actually think that sanctions, for instance, have a big role to play in terms of deterring China, because at the current economic relationship, I think there's a much higher likelihood that America is deterred from doing anything to intervene by virtue of the economic costs that it would involve. Like, I think there's going to be a lot of, if like this were to happen tomorrow, I think there'd be a lot of headwinds politically against intervening militarily or even going with significant sanctions on China.
Yeah, let's spend one more second on this before we begin to wrap up. What are the economic repercussions of war with China, or China, not just taking Taiwan, which we just covered? I mean, talk a little bit about the New York perspective, as you just mentioned, about our economic relationships with China and in Asia. I mean, this would be economically catastrophic for the United States, would it not?
Yeah, I think the best estimates are that even just a war itself, setting apart any sanctions or cut off of trade done by sort of the economic tools that I talk about in Chokepoints, my book, I think it would cost something like 10% of global GDP, right? So, I mean, this is dramatic, right? And not just a recession at home, but really everywhere. So I do think that hopefully that can be an impediment, right? Because if the Chinese were to act, they don't know where that will lead, right? Sure, if the Chinese think that they can win without fighting, right, which is, the Sun Tzu adage. And by the way, it's what I think motivates American economic warfare too. It's trying to get what you want without fighting. If the Chinese think they can do that, maybe they'll be enticed to do it. But you got to imagine there's always a shadow of a doubt. And what happens if they do wind up in a shooting war with the United States? I mean, not only does that risk, nuclear escalation, but it also, more directly, even if you can avoid that, will crush the global economy. So you really, really have to hope that deterrence succeeds.
So your book is amazingly educational on all of these top issues of the day. Can we talk a little bit about the future of economic warfare? I mean, first of all, I was in the Bush NSC in the Counterproliferation Office. We just thought all day long of who can we blacklist, who can we designate, why can't we do oil sanctions, why can't we do the Central Bank of Iran? This was obviously 07, 08. All those things, many of those things were later done. I mean, that's just the way people think in Washington. You don't go to meetings to say we shouldn't be doing these and sanctions and blacklisting. So the mindset would probably need to change over time if we want to make sure that a lot of these tools remain viable for the actual best use of them, right? I mean, how are we going to switch? How's your book going to help us switch on the mindset of these policymakers?
It's funny, Mike. I think, all of us have these formative experiences, and oftentimes they're forged in the Situation Room. And for me, honestly, the book was motivated by my experience a little bit after that in the Obama years, sitting in the Situation Room whenever sanctions would come up. And this was like in the context of talking about the response to the Crimea annexation. I would notice that maybe one or two people had really well-formed opinions, and everybody else really went quiet, because these tools still are pretty arcane to a lot of people in Washington. Whereas, we would talk about, should we arm the Ukrainians? And everybody had an opinion. It wasn't just the Pentagon, it was the CIA, it was the State Department, it was, everyone had an opinion. And what a big reason I wrote this book is I think we need to elevate our national discourse on the use of economic warfare, because it's reshaping the global economy. We do not live in the age of globalization anymore. Economic relations are not win-win. And if we're gonna come out of this age of economic warfare with our prosperity and peace intact, we need to use these weapons wisely. And so I'm hopeful that as people read Chokepoints and are inspired to learn more about these topics, that we can have a more intelligent national conversation. The one final point, though, I'll make, Michael, is, I commend Secretary Bessent for coming out and saying that we need to use sanctions more wisely. What I'll also say is that this was something that Biden said early in his term, too. And we have seen an exponential growth in sanctions that has crossed parties, crossed administrations over the last 2 decades. And I think there's a fundamental tension where the global economy is still designed for the benign geopolitical environment of the 1990s. But as you said a few moments ago, we are living in a period of fierce geopolitical competition. So it's incumbent upon our leaders to put forward that vision of what should the global economic order look like that is compatible with the geopolitical competition we see today.
So this makes your book a must read. But last question, there's still going to be policymakers that want to impose costs on bad actors around the world. What are the new choke points? Is it tariffs? We talk tariffs. We didn't think before Trump came along that we'd be talking about tariffs anymore as a country. What are they? What do we do? What should policymakers do if they want to impose a cost on someone?
Yeah. So the choke points of the global economy, which are these areas where one country has a dominant position and there are very few substitutes, they change over time, right? I mean, because they're not, it's rare that a government says, I'm going to create a choke point and they create it, right? It's the private sector creates these things through their own innovation, and then government figures out how to weaponize it. We talked about the dollar. It's very possible that in 5 to 10 years, the way international payments is done is disrupted. I think digital currencies are going to disrupt how cross-border payments work. Right now, China is significantly more advanced in digital currencies than the US is. This could be a significant shift in power from the US to China. On things like clean energy supply chains, right? You're going from the critical minerals to the batteries to the finished electric vehicles. China dominates, right? That's another sector where China dominates. Thankfully, so far in artificial intelligence, which I think is another obviously very important growing economic area, from the semiconductors to the actual large language models themselves, it is American companies that are currently in the lead, right? So I think that the flip side of the weaponization of choke points is we do need domestic economic dynamism. And that means investing in key sectors of our economy. It means bringing in the best and the brightest talent to this country to create the innovations that will be the choke points of tomorrow. And it means having smart economic policies that lead to economic growth at home. And so I do think that these choke points will change, and much of that comes down to our own domestic economic health and dynamism.
Eddie, this is essential reading for all of us. Congratulations on the success of your book, Chokepoints, American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare. And thank you for coming to see us today.
Great to be here, Michael. Thanks for having me.
That was Eddie Fishman. I'm Michael Allen. Please join us next week for another episode of Intelligence Matters.
Intelligence Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. Intelligence Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.